Well, it's time to begin our class this morning. Good to see everybody. Does anyone not have their lesson 5 worksheets with them today? Anybody not have it? Does anyone need it? Well, great. Everybody came to class prepared. That's great. I was going to give you the web address. You could pull it up on your cell phone or your iPad if you have it with you, if you don't have it. See, it's padfield.com/acrobat/Taylor/prison.pdf. Things with computers are so logical, aren't they? Most of the time. Okay, so we're going to talk about the book of Colossians today, kind of in general terms as an introduction. Colossians being one of the prison epistles written by Paul during his first Roman imprisonment. What were the other 3? Ephesians, Philippians, and Philemon. And you'll notice we have Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians are right together in our Bibles. And then Philemon, of course, is a separate book. Philemon becomes an important factor actually in the study of Colossae, because in whose home did the church at Colossae meet? Which would be? Did I hear someone say Philemon? I thought I did, yes. They met in Philemon's house. And so Philemon is intimately associated with the book of Colossae, and as a result of Philemon being associated with the church of Colossae, his slave, who Paul converted in Rome, would be connected with that group. And who was that? Onesimus. Okay, so you see how these letters are interrelated, and the characters that are common to one or can be common to another. It's very interesting to see the interaction. And some of the most interesting verses that you'll read in these books are like the last 4, 5, 6 verses of each book, because in many of these cases, Paul either salutes someone or he sends greetings from a group of individuals who are with him in prison at this time that may have come from some of these congregations that he's writing to, or known to these people in these different congregations. And so even though Paul is in prison in Rome, the lines of communication between him and many of the churches, particularly in Asia, are wide open because of messengers that are traveling back and forth, carrying reports from the churches to Paul, how they're doing, and from Paul to them, and so forth. So Titius is one of the main ones, and Onesimus are thought to have been the ones who actually hand carried the letter to the church at Ephesus, the church at Colossae, and the letter to Philemon. So kind of keep that in mind as we proceed along in our study as well. Okay. Right. Made transportation from place to place quite easy, or much easier than it would have been in more ancient times, at least. Okay. Greg, would you mind leading us in a prayer before we get started this morning? Amen. Okay. Um, so to start out, we'll just kind of put ourselves in perspective from a geographic standpoint. The church at Colossae is right here. The church at Ephesus is here. So Colossae is, as I think it's mentioned in the workbook, is about 100 miles east of Ephesus. And there are 3 cities in this general area that are important. It's called the Tri-City area: Colossae, Laodicea, and Hierapolis, or Hierapolis. Each one of these congregations is about 12 miles apart, and it's called the Tri-City area, kind of like we're in the Tri-City area, right? Clarksville, Jeffersonville, and New Albany. Well, these were the Tri-City areas of ancient times, but they're a little bit farther apart than what our cities are. Hierapolis was kind of a pleasure center. It was known for its culture and kind of probably debauchery more than anything else. Laodicea was known as an important commercial center and trade center. It was on one of the trade routes leading to Ephesus and then on to Athens and Rome. And then Colossae, Brother Copeland's introduction to Colossians says Colossae was noted as a small town. And so it was a smaller community than these other 2, and some estimate its population at 25 to 30,000 people maybe. But the other important thing in these 3 cities was scattered amongst these 3 cities were about 11,000 Jews at this time. And so the Jewish influence on the pre-established Christian church was quite strong. And as you can imagine, as Paul went about his first and second, particularly second missionary journey, who followed him all the way? Judaizing teachers trying to impose those things that were in the letter that Paul was actually carrying from the brethren in Jerusalem, saying we're not going to hold these Gentiles hostage to things of Judaism, such as circumcision, keeping feast days and all that sort of thing. That has nothing to do with Christianity. By the same token, their paganism has nothing to do with Christianity either, so they need to avoid that. The Jews can't impose Judaizing ceremonial law on Christians, neither can individuals who've been converted out of paganism impose pagan practices on the Christians as well. And so these are some of the very issues that are addressed in the book of Colossians. So God's scheme of redemption is the primary theme of both Ephesians and Colossians. And what was emphasized in the book of Ephesians, as you remember? How did Paul approach what he was teaching the church at Ephesus? What did he emphasize? Well, in the book of Ephesus, or in the book of Ephesians, Paul brought out what was the central. Right. There's this oneness that he talked about: one Lord, one Spirit, one baptism, one church, okay, with Christ as its head. And what physical relationship did he use to compare Christians in the church to? Husband and wife, the marriage relationship. So Paul uses the example of the marriage relationship to explain Christ's relationship to the church and the church's relationship to Christ and to God. So there's this unity in the church. The church is emphasized in the book of Ephesians. So in Colossians, however, according to what you read in your previous studies Where does Paul put his emphasis? On Christ. On Christ. Because in Colossae, there was a lot of false teaching going on and a lot of Judaizing teachers that were trying to impose ceremonial law on Christians. And by the same token, there were a lot of philosophical Greeks who were trying to impose paganism and paganistic philosophies onto the Christians. And so all of these things minimize the importance of whom? Christ. Christ is taking second place to all these other things. And so even though Paul doesn't specifically state the areas of concern in so many words in the book of Colossians, a lot of times we can imply what the question is by what the answer is, right? So if someone gives you an answer, you can kind of backtrack and figure out what the question was that prompted that answer, right? So a lot of these places in the book of Colossians where Paul is admonishing them to do this or that, or beware of this or that, you can kind of infer what the issue was that prompted that response, okay? And so as a result, in Colossae, in the book of Colossians, the deity of Christ is emphasized to counteract the teachings of the Gnostics and those who would promote this idea of asceticism, which is it's one of those words you don't use every day, right? So a lot of we'll get into the specifics of that in just a minute, but these are the two main areas that are addressed in the book of Colossians.
That's why this book is so important today. We see that going on in this world today, where we emphasize Christ, his role in Christianity, and so just as they have the same problems, we're having the same problems today.
Man's always trying to improve on God's plan, isn't he? And so as a result of man philosophizing, theorizing, trying to figure things out, explaining human terms, rather than just accepting what the scripture says as fact, we run into all these different isms that creep into our thinking. So anyway, what is asceticism? Asceticism is a notion of the importance of severe self-discipline. In other words, I almost look at it as self-mutilation. Paul said in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, that he had to buffet his body to keep it into subjection. Why? Huh? Right? Well, if he didn't do that, what would happen? If he didn't keep himself under control, he would set such a bad example to others that would cause them to be lost, and he himself would become a castaway. Okay? So Paul emphasized the importance of self-discipline. However, this asceticism theory took it to the extreme and thought that rather than depending on the grace of God and Christ saving you from your sins, there was something that you could do to so deface yourself before God that it's almost self-salvation from self-discipline. And then the other thing was the avoidance of all indulgences. It was almost like living a monastic life or a life of a hermit, which you would, what were those pictures we used to see back in the old days of what Mahatma Gandhi sitting on a bed of nails or things like that? Just self-mutilation, self-torture. All these things were thought to bring one closer to God, which is very similar to what the Gnostics taught. What was Gnosticism? He talks about that a little bit in here, I think.
Like a form of philosophy that
Well, exactly. Depending on human wisdom to provide for one's salvation rather than God. And the thing behind that was the Gnostics had this false notion that all flesh is sinful. It's almost like today, what did John Calvin espouse? Hmm? Well, one of the things of the Calvin, he thought all people are born in sin. Man is innately sinful. In other words, when a child is born, he carries he inherits Adam's sin, and so he is a sinner at birth, even though we read that sin is a violation of law, and infants can't violate laws that they're not aware of and not mature enough to understand. But be that as it may, the Gnostics thought that all flesh was inherently sinful. Therefore, they denied Jesus' coming in the flesh, because if he came in the flesh, what would Jesus have had to have been, according to the Gnostics? A sinner. Yeah. So Gnostics were denying that Jesus actually came in the flesh. You know, in 1 Corinthians 15, there were a lot of people in Corinth that apparently had espoused the idea that Jesus had never what? Or he never resurrected from the dead, right? They denied the resurrection, okay? So if you denied the resurrection of Christ, what did Paul say you're left with? Yeah, a vain religion, because the whole religion of Christ is dependent upon Christ's resurrection. So the Gnostics, as Ron pointed out, philosophized that if all sin is flesh, then Jesus could not possibly have actually come in the flesh and walked on this earth, or he'd been a sinner, right? That makes logical sense, doesn't it? If you accept the false premise. Therefore, Jesus has not come in the flesh. And if you turn over to 1 John, the 4th chapter, and I want somebody to read verses 2 and 3 for us, because John addresses, this was a very prevalent doctrine in the first century. This isn't something just unique to Colossae. I mean, it's dealt with in various forms in other books of the New Testament. But in John's letter, in the 4th chapter, somebody read, just read verses 1 through 3 for us. Or wait a minute. Yeah, 1 through 3 would be good.
Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. Because many false prophets have gone out of the world. By this you know that the Spirit of God, every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh, is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that it is coming, and now is already in the world.
John is talking about the Gnostics there. This is a blatant condemnation of Gnosticism in 1 John 4. So John addressed this. Paul is addressing it with the church at Colossae. This is a false doctrine. Jesus did come in the flesh. If he didn't come in the flesh, how could he have been raised from the dead? Right? So it's all implies the very same outcome. So Gnosticism views on personal behavior, they ascribe to total withdrawal, or this idea of asceticism, denying all bodily appetites. Now, if we turn over to the 2nd chapter of Colossians, and verses 18 through 23 actually addresses this. And so by the admonition that Paul gives the brethren at Colossae, we can infer that he is addressing this idea of the Gnostics as being talked about here. So if you begin at verse 18 in chapter 2, let's read a few verses here. Let no man beguile you let no one beguile you of your reward in a voluntary humility and worshiping of angels, intruding in those things which he has not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind, and not holding the head, from which all the body, by joints and hands, have nourishment ministered and knit together, increases with the increase of God. Wherefore, therefore, if you be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why, as though living in the world, you're now subject to ordinances, touch not, taste not, handle not, which are all to perish with the using and the commandments and doctrines of men, which things have indeed a show of wisdom in will worship and humility and neglecting of the body, not in any honor of the satisfying of the flesh. So this very materialistic view of one's body and its relationship to how they're to worship or draw closer to God was something that Paul identifies as originating in the mind of man, not in the mind of God, and something to be avoided. And then the other thing that they subscribed to was the opposite extreme of unrestrained living, gratifying any fleshly lust. And so they reasoned that the spirit can't be tainted by the body. And so if that be the case, then it's like the body and the spirit can just operate independently of one another. The body may be inherently sinful, but the spirit can do things outside the body that has no influence on it. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? But those were Gnostics. And that problem or that question is addressed in the first 17 verses of the 3rd chapter of Colossians. Did you realize the book of Colossians is only 95 verses long? Did you look at that? It's a very short book, but it's got not as short as Philemon, but it has a lot of information in those 95 verses. Any thoughts so far? Stuff we've talked about.
I think he's writing in a letter primarily to settle this problem. He's not going outside, he's not making outside. He could have, but he didn't. There's only 4 chapters.
Right.
It's just another condemnation on man getting too high and mighty on his own intellect instead of listening to what God has told us, Christ told us.
Right. And it shows you what kind of influence pre-existing teaching can have on a group of people who have supposedly been converted to Christ. Because he's writing to the Christians there. Don't succumb to this line of thinking. Don't be influenced by these people to try to drag this philosophy into your Christian worship. And so what do we have today as far as influences on the church?
You've got every other body that claims to be the church, wants to propose their own theory.
It's almost like we try to find things in the world that we can bring into the church to make the church more palatable to people, more appealing to people. Back in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, amongst people who were supposed to be following the New Testament pattern of Christianity, things started creeping in to make the church more palatable to other people. Well, let's start have dinner on the grounds after services on Sunday. Well, to make that easier, let's just put a kitchen in. We'll have us a kitchen. And then it'd be nice if Christians could get together for wholesome recreation. Let's put a gymnasium in. That's real important to the work of the church. And once you open the floodgates, where do you stop? And that's exactly what's Paul's talking about here in the 1st century. You start letting these things creep in to your worship, and what becomes your focus then? Is it on Christ? Is Christ still who we're depending upon our salvation? Or are we starting more to depend on our own self-righteousness that's been defined by us, by the way? And if we deny ourselves these things, and if we live a certain way and try to abuse our bodies because we believe it's sinful and we're trying to purify it. And by the way, worshiping angels was another thing that was creeping into the church at this time. Start worshiping angels. Now today we have worshiping of saints. We have images erected in places of worship of quote unquote saints, revering certain individuals in the Bible, such as Mary, with special powers and so forth that we have no biblical basis for. So there's all kinds of things like that that creeps into the church because of the dissatisfaction of man, or because of man's imagination, or however you want to describe it. Any other thoughts on that? Albert, you're being awfully quiet this morning.
Just listening.
Just listening. I was always told that was the best thing to do. That's why you have 2 ears and only one mouth, right? All right. So, moving on. So the church at Colossae. So when did Paul establish the church at Colossae? Okay. Is there any evidence that Paul ever set foot in Colossae? No. Read the first verse of chapter 2. Someone read that for us.
For I want you to know how great a struggle I have on your behalf, for those who are in Laodicea, for all those who have not personally seen my face.
Well, there you go. So it sounds like Paul has never really been at Colossae, but as Alan pointed out during his extended stay at Ephesus, who did it say had heard the gospel during this 2 or 3 year period Paul spent at Ephesus? All of Asia. Well, going back to our map here, all this area is Asia, this present day Turkey. The whole area is Asia, and then Asia is divided up into different subsections: Pamphylia, Pisidia, Galatia, Mysia, Phrygia is where Colossae was. And so there are a lot of different areas in Asia, but yeah, I said all Asia. People came from far and wide to hear the Apostle Paul. And it's thought that Epaphras, who is the one who carried this letter, who brought news of these goings on at Colossae to Paul in prison, probably prompting Paul to write this letter to them to explain these things to them. He is thought to have been a local person from Colossae, actually, and had connections with them, brought him information about the church, which prompted the letter, even though he had never been there personally himself. So, okay. So if Paul didn't establish a church at Colossae, we don't really know how it started, except maybe it was possibly by those taught during the stay at Ephesus, which was recorded in the 19th chapter of Acts, or it could have been established by Epaphras, according to verse 12 of chapter 4, which implies that he was from Colossae originally. He seemed to be a native of the city. And then the other members we already mentioned, Philemon was a member of the church at Colossae. And from reading Philemon, the church met in his house. And then Apaphia and Archippus may have been his parents. and then Onesimus was his slave. Um, and so we read about him extensively in the book of Philemon. So there was a good nucleus of Christians in Colossae, and it's Paul's intention to help encourage them to remain strong in the Lord and not to falter in the face of these false doctrines that are being taught. Okay, so the purpose of the epistle, as we point out, number one, are warnings against relapsing into paganism. Let's just look at a few of these texts here. Someone read chapter 1, verses 21 through 23, and then 2 in verse 6, and 3 in verses 5 through 11. Let's turn to those just a minute. Someone care to read 21 through 23 of chapter 1?
And although you were formerly alienated, hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds, yet he has now reconciled you in his fleshly body through death, in order to present you before him wholly blameless and beyond reproach. And indeed, you continue in the faith firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in the whole creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a witness.
Okay, so and then encouraging them to remain faithful according to the hope of the gospel, which you have heard. So they've been taught, possibly by Epaphras or others who have been under Paul's tutelage, and so they know the truth and they're encouraged to stay by it. How about verse 6 of chapter 2?
Therefore, as you receive Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him.
Okay, well, what does that mean?
You guys can do the foundation.
Yeah. You've heard the word, so now live it, right? Yeah, don't just receive the word that I've delivered to you just in an academic sense and then go back to your paganism, but actually practice what's been preached to you. And then how about 3, 5 through 11? Ron, you got that?
Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, or covetousness, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them.
11.
But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds, and have put on the new man, who is renewed in knowledge, according to the image of him who created him. Where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all.
Okay. So all these things of the world, they're to put off and have no more dealings with them, not use them in a religious sense, certainly, as the pagans did. He says, you were pagans at one time, but you've been enlightened now. You're following after Christ. So don't fall back into those. Don't be tempted to fall back into those old practices once again. Okay. And then they're also encouraged to not accept the teaching of this, what's called the Colossian heresy, which actually denied the preeminence of Christ, which we already talked about. The salvation that comes through Jesus Christ. He is the way. Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except by me." There isn't any other way. But a lot of people in that day were denying Christ, the sufficiency of Christ to provide for their salvation. And then this Jewish ceremonialism, circumcision, keeping the Sabbath day, offering sacrifices, burning incense, all these ceremonial things that were lawful under the Old Testament law that have been nailed to the cross. Jesus has fulfilled the law. It's no longer in effect. They shouldn't be relying on these ceremonial things of Judaism in their worship. And then angel worship. Look at chapter 2 and verse 18. He said, "Let no man beguile you of your reward in a voluntary humility and worshiping of angels, intruding into these things which he has not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind." So just because man can conjure up in his mind, oh, we should worship angels, that would be a good thing to do. Does that make it right? What's a puffed up mind? Arrogant, yeah. Think you know more than God. Think you're all wise. And apparently some in that day thought they were, I guess, because they were propagating this false teaching. And then this asceticism, this harsh treatment of the body, trying to control one's lust by mutilating the body or doing something to their body to keep them from sinning in a lustful way. That was, rather than letting their mind be controlling their body, they were actually physically doing things to their body to that could be, yeah. I would think that would be a possibility at least. So anyway. So the solution, what's the solution to the problem? Follow the Son. Jesus is all sufficient. There in the 13th to the 16th verses of chapter 1, he tells us how all sufficient Christ is. Somebody read verses 13 through 16 of chapter 1. Alan, do you have that?
Yes. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption for the forgiveness of sins.
Two more.
He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him.
Okay. So Jesus has the preeminence, and he is the one that we should depend upon and put our trust in. And he is the one whom God has designated as the one through whom salvation should come.
You know, sometimes when you read this, you think hundreds of years is going on here and all that things are happening, and you can't really take it into context. But Jesus' ministry started around 27 AD to the Jews. He died around 30 AD. This is taking place probably somewhere between 55 and 60 AD. We're talking 20 years. 20 years, we get angel worship. We got the mixing of paganism and Christianity and all these different things. I mean, 20 years.
Well, you have to remember, Christianity is the new kid on the block, so to speak, right? All these other things that they've been doing for centuries, right? I mean, the pagan worship has been going on for millennia, probably, and people who didn't know God. And so it's hard to just suddenly get rid of all this stuff and just purely be worshiping Christ. Think of all the conflicting things that had to be going on in the minds of these Gentile Christians who had been converted. I mean, they'd worship this way all their lives if they worshiped at all. And now Paul has introduced this notion of Christ and God's plan to save man through Christ and the church. And it's a totally new concept to them. They're used to building monuments to the things that they worshiped, i.e. the temple to Diana in Ephesus and places like that. And now to be worshiping this invisible God and his son, and there's no tangible things I can grab a hold of to connect myself to him. It's bound to have been a shock to their system and hard to get rid of when you stop and think about it, which, as Gerald pointed out, translating down to our day, the same problem exists in people being converted today out of either a false religion, such as Islam or Hinduism or whatever, or people who have had espoused some form of Christianity that's perverted and need to get back to just what the Bible teaches. It's hard for them to get rid of the traditions and practices and so forth that maybe they have done in the past, just to get back to plain New Testament Christianity like it was practiced in the first century. And so it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. So to follow the Son and then reject the solutions of men who do not elevate Christ to his point of preeminence. So what did John say back in 1 John 4? If a person doesn't acknowledge that Christ came in the flesh, how are you to consider him? Him being the person who denied Jesus came in the flesh, that is. He is the Antichrist. He's Antichrist. Christ came in the flesh. If you deny that Christ came in the flesh, you're Antichrist. You're against Christ, because Christ did come in the flesh. And because he came in the flesh, he could be crucified on a cross and he could be raised from the dead. If he didn't come in the flesh, he couldn't have been crucified on a cross, and he couldn't have been raised from the dead, because he didn't come from the flesh and be alive as a human being on earth in the first place, if you espouse that notion.
Without that, you don't have any form of Christianity.
No. I mean, that's the whole Christian system is based on the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And the fact that he was the Son of God, lived a sinless life on earth, and God's plan was to save the world through the sacrifice of his Son. So,
See this kind of stuff going on today, where people are trying to lessen the importance of the church. They're taking something that Jesus said he died for, and they're saying that, well, that's not as important. Just accept Jesus.
it seems that most generic preachers, I'll call them, that you hear today, find that the only thing that most people can agree on is Jesus. We all love Jesus, right? Jesus loves you and you love Jesus. Well, we can all agree on that. Now, as far as this church business goes, that's a whole different subject. So why do you hear these televangelists and evangelists, these mega churches and so forth, all they preach on is your relationship to the Lord? What does Joel Osteen preach on? Your relationship to the Lord. The Lord has great plans for you. He wants you to be successful. Everything that the Lord wants you to be, Joel wants you to enjoy in this life. It seems like, from listening to him on the radio. I'm not sure how much emphasis he puts on actual eternal salvation, but if you just live for Jesus this life, he wants you to be well off. I don't know, he thinks everybody's going to be a millionaire or something like that, but it seems like the material side is always, your health will be better, your wealth will be better, your affiliation with others will be much better, and all this type of philosophy. But then, even Billy Graham, although he had excellent lessons on morality, and some of the best lessons you'd ever want to hear preached were preached by Billy Graham until you got to what you need to do to be saved. And then it's always the sinner's prayer, which you don't read in the Bible. And then go out and find you a good Bible-based church to worship with. Like, there are all these churches out there. There's a lot of Bible-based churches out here. Teach the Bible. They all teach a little Bible, I guess. Go find the one, I guess, that suits your needs the best, and you work real hard with that group or whatever, as if they're all okay. So, man hasn't changed any in 2,000 years. If the world's still here 2,000 years from now, he probably won't have changed then either. But anyway, reject the solutions of men who do not put Christ in the position of preeminence. And we need to do the same thing today. Reject those. You notice on your first page there that he drew some comparisons with the book of Ephesians, and he made a note that 78 out of the 95 verses in Colossians have a marked resemblance to verses in Ephesians. And he gives a few examples down here. Ephesians 1 and 7, Colossians 1:14, which says, in who we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. And over in the book of Ephesians, it's interesting just to flip back and forth and read these verses for comparison. Ephesians says, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of his grace, almost the exact quotation. And so there are very many, very similar verses. But keep in mind, the book of Ephesians was written to a congregation of people with whom Paul had spent a lot of time. And as he's encouraging them to remain faithful and reminding them that they once were Gentiles, separate and apart from God, but now God has united Jew and Gentile together as one in the church. And each and every one of them is just as much a part of the church as any faithful Jew who has been converted to Christ. So it's been God's eternal plan. They're not second-class citizens. God has planned from eternity that all men would be reconciled through Christ in the church. That's the big message in Ephesians. Colossians, on the other hand, is written to warn these people in Colossae to reject all these false teachings that have been trying to creep into their congregation of paganism, Judaism, these different philosophical ways of how man should conduct his everyday life, because all of these things denigrate the importance of Jesus Christ as our Savior. And so in Ephesians, the church is elevated to a high position in the mind of God and importance. And in Colossians, Jesus is elevated. So to answer the current present day preachers out there who want to preach all about Jesus, they're Colossians preachers. They're just preaching about Jesus all the time. They need to read the book of Ephesians and start preaching some of that along with it, because they're both equally important, but they both address, totally different problems. Well, not necessarily problems at Ephesus, but problems that Christians in those two different cities faced. So, okay. So Wednesday night, who has it Wednesday night? Jeff? We'll let Jeff start into chapter 1 and start our discussion on it. Okay, thanks.